think there is a huge topic that again involves the aesthetic, the ethics, politics, theory, cultural theory, but also the imagination of the world, how we imagine and how we can act within the sublime dimension of catastrophe. And that we go back again to Kant, and we can go back to classical philosophy that have theorized, for some reason, the notion of the sublime, in which aesthetic, political, and ethic elements converge. So I think that this is the challenge that these topics of calamity and limits and microhistories bring to me, and this is what I'm going to be thinking about in the next, in many months after this meeting.
Another question? Comment?
Yeah, I have a question. What I'm wondering is whether or not we need to think about, in terms of an expediency of nature, which is to say, thinking about the longer history of the anthropological culture concept, in part emerged as a response to the concept of nature. That is, cultural particularism was a rebuttal against sort of the universalism associated with a certain understanding of nature. And it strikes me that nature has come back as a concept in a major way in relation to the climate crisis. And in the popular imagination, that concept gets co-opted by certain cultures of consumption. The best example of this are these bottles of water that we have right in front of us that assure us by consuming, if we only consume better, we're going to make a difference. And so there's a sense in which that we can consume ourselves out of this climate crisis. And that, I think, reinscribes this idea of sovereignty that you're trying to critique. And I think, interestingly enough, there's a parallel in academic discourse, which is, and I work in literary studies, but in eco-criticism, at least in the 19th century, people who study the 19th century often reinscribe this figure of individual sovereignty, coming from Thoreau onwards. And so I guess I just sort of want to open up whether or not at this juncture we need to not just think about culture, but how do what do we make of the concept of nature? Do we need to rethink the relationship between nature and culture? And also this sort of constellation of concepts that are in a web with this concept of nature. So environment, green, ecology. So I just sort of, I guess, want to open that up.
No, I would agree. Actually, I think that at one level, there's been a combination of culture and nature. And this you could see clearly in those contexts that I mentioned, New Zealand and Costa Rica, where as I was saying before, the consciousness of what it means to be the husbands of nature is done culturally. And then, as in the case that you were talking about, the consumption as a solution for solving problems, in these two particular places that have also opened up ecotourism as part of the way in which, part of what enables conservation is actually what also undoes conservation. So it's a similar logic to the one you were saying about consuming, that through that process we can solve that. And so at least at that dimension, the cultural issue, the expediency of culture really is overlaid on the question of nature.
Someone else has a question. I'm interested in what happens to the idea of culture when we expand and multiply the scales in this way. I mean, I'm thinking about the way in which the concept of culture emerges as a response to a sense of crisis at particular moments. So in the 1860s, Matthew Arnold mobilizes the idea of culture as a response to a national problem. The working classes in England, in Britain, may get access to political power. What do we do? And then in the 1950s and 1960s, culture becomes the response to a crisis which is a world crisis. Decolonization, development. So C.P. Snow develops the idea of the two cultures, which is not really the difference between literary culture and scientific culture. It's really the difference between the rich and the poor, and the fact that Arnold's man of culture can't solve that crisis and thinks that he has culture all to himself, when what we really need are better scientists who will go out and solve the problem of global inequality. And or Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict mobilizing an idea of culture as a response to ethnocentrism. Well, if we can figure out the relationship between different cultures better at this moment, then the problem will be solved. Now, if the scale is neither national nor global but planetary, does the concept of culture as a response to that crisis disappear? Or are there ways in which we can still find that concept useful, but as one concept among many, rather than Snow and Arnold were both wrong that culture was going to be the response to this crisis. That was too simple, and in a way was a way of replicating or reconsolidating power relations that were under threat. So what happens now to the concept of culture?
We had Frank, and then, or do you want to go to Tracy first?
Just as a response to that, Tim, and I think to some of the things that were said, it seems very much this conversation happens at a moment in which we have, as academics, as intellectuals, and as cultures, appropriated the concept of culture as something that we very self-consciously have a hand in. And so we no longer think of it as something that is either biological or inherent or limiting, in the sense that we have given ourselves the ability to create cultures, to shift cultures, to reject culture, and to reformulate it. So we could only ever think of something like a planetary culture probably at this moment. I mean, as an archaeologist, I don't want to say that there haven't been moments in which people didn't also self-create very vast sort of expedient ideas of culture, but I think it's very much a moment right now that we are in, and in that sense, we should see it as a tool in the way that we think about cultures as something that can be consciously manipulated and driven, as opposed to imposed and limiting in their definition.
Frank?
My question, I hope, would apply to the remarks that all of you have made in different ways. As we were thinking about the topic and trying to bring together we privileged culture over disciplines, because we talked about the need to imagine culture and cultures, but we presumed the need to rethink disciplines. And at this point, after the presentations that you've made and the others of our presenters have made, I'm led to ask, I guess, something along these lines. Erna provided a way of thinking about or of practicing a revised ethnography that is also a political action and celebration, that is also a historical reenaction, that is also a work of theater. What I'm interested in asking is, and it also develops from some of what both Mabel and Deepesh said, is whether you can imagine what the uses of the disciplines that we now have are going to be, and how they might be productively rethought in combination with each other. That's taking asking you to take a proleptic look. It's impossible to answer, I understand, but I would be very interested in your takes on that question.
Related to that, one of the things is the place of emotion, because Erna, you were talking about how emotion was what was missing from the academic ethnography, and I'm actually seeing a lot of, and that was most explicit, I think, in Erna's talk, but, Deepesh, you were also talking, I think the message that the and we actually talked about this privately too, but the idea of humility or compassion, those kinds of things that tend to get left out of academic discourse. And Mabel, one of the your talk was very helpful to me to thinking about antagonism, political antagonism, in as an you were talking about whether antagonism is necessary in thinking about multiculturalism and diversity versus difference. So, is emotion one thing, or affect something that is a factor that needs to be taken into account as we rethink disciplines? And I think psychoanalysis obviously has talked about that, but in a very much more analytical or critical way. But I wonder if there's a way to sort of mobilize emotion in a positive way in rethinking culture and disciplines.
I want to say something which doesn't necessarily respond to anybody's question, but mine, which is inside here. This talk about planets and so on has me very frightened, and I'm taken back when we mentioned the word culture to a time when there was something I remember called personal culture. And I'm wondering whether right now, certainly for me, the concept is very, very important, because I feel, and I'm tying it also to the question I asked about the spirit, whether it is not now time for somebody like me to spend some time dealing with the personal culture, which involves the emotion, which involves the spiritual as well, so that I can handle the planet.
Would you all like to address?
Just the ones I can. I mean, those are all very useful comments, and I don't know where to start. But to start with, maybe I'll start with Mihoko's question. It's clear from people who do cognitive science, and I'm thinking of popular books like Damasio's book, Descartes' Error. Now it's people who do brain studies, it's very clear that the distinction that old philosophers used to make between reason and emotion doesn't hold. Actually, every impersonal argument, even a scientific argument, produces affect in the brain. So there's not going to be a human world in which there'll be affect-less propositions. Propositions will carry an affective charge with them, and that could be pathos, that could be humility, that could be fright, all kinds of things. And that cloud is not going to go away. Just as I was simply, I was posing the planetary as a problem of thought, not as a solved problem, but as something that should lace our thinking, almost as a limit problem, as Mabel was saying. Because you see, what has happened if you think of the philosophy of rights? You go back and read John Stuart Mill. 19th century thinkers of rights used to think of rights as concentric circles. So you had individual rights, you had national rights, and rights were not incompatible with, one right was not incompatible with one another. What has happened in the post-war world is the rights language has proliferated so much that we actually now hold contradictory rights. We have rights that contradict. Rights of a group can contradict the rights of an individual. And it comes up all the time in indigenous histories, So in a way, when I was saying that the idea of agency as sovereignty has proliferated, it's part of the business of rights language proliferating. And, and every exercise of rights entails consumption of resources. There's no question.